Today is Saturday, June 17th, and today we'll be doing a deep dive into the biggest political story right now, federal charges against former President Donald Trump. And we're discussing it from a lot of different angles: national security, legal, political, and how it's being covered across various media outlets. Now remember, this is a historic situation. No former or sitting president has ever been prosecuted on federal charges before, and it comes as Trump continues his campaign to get back to the White House in 2024. Later, we'll get into how both right and left-leaning news outlets are covering this story, and advice for news consumers taking it all in. But first, let's talk about the actual case, from the charges to the national security details to the potential conflicts of interest. Here to offer his take is legal expert Jamil Jaffer. He's a lawyer and the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University. His credentials also include time spent as a White House associate counsel for President George W. Bush. He's weighing in on the seriousness of the charges, but also why it's all so very complicated. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Jamil, thank you so much for coming back on the Newsworthy.
Absolutely, Erica. Thanks for having me.
So federal prosecutors are saying that Trump mishandled classified documents that had really sensitive information. So we're talking about info related to nuclear programs, attack plans, that sort of thing. Were you expecting that? And what was your reaction when that indictment actually came down with those details?
Well, we knew that the president had highly sensitive documents, and we knew that because the FBI had told us that some of the documents were top secret, that there was sensitive compartmented information. But I think what's kind of been shocking about the 31 documents listed in the indictment is some of these materials, 10 of the 31 documents charged, are top secret sensitive compartmented information, which means it's even more sensitive. And another 8, so 18 total, were in what are called special access programs. That's even more sensitive than SCI. These are very, very highly classified materials. And then you heard some of the details, some of the general descriptions of them, and even that was surprising. And so I think, Erica, in a lot of ways, I think everyone realized these documents were a lot more sensitive than even we had thought before. And the idea that the former president would take them out of the White House, bring them to Mar-a-Lago, leave them sitting around in a ballroom and potentially in a bathroom, and it seems kind of crazy.
And you're speaking to this a little bit already, but what are the stakes really when it comes to national security with some of this information? The
concern, obviously, is that people who are not authorized to have access, whether Americans or foreigners, but more importantly, foreigners, and most importantly, our adversaries, if they had access to the information, they would know a lot of things about our capabilities. One, where do we collect? How do we collect information? Who can we hear? Who are we listening on? Where do we have human sources, right? What is our analysis of that information, right? They would learn a tremendous amount, not just about what we know and what we think about it, but how we collect. That could lead to, literally, for human sources, people losing their lives, or for signals intelligence and imagery, us losing the capability to collect, because once they know how we collect, they can take measures to avoid that type of collection.
Let's talk about some of the allegations, the charges from a legal perspective. What's your take on those 37 counts that Trump is facing? If he's ultimately convicted, what could happen? What could he face?
Well, look, on the first 31 counts that relate to the willful retention of national defense information, the Justice Department has to prove a few things. One, that he had unauthorized access to these documents, that the documents related to the national defense, that he willfully retained them, and that he did not turn them over to somebody in the U.S. government that was entitled to receive them. Now, based on the facts the Justice Department has alleged in the indictment, if they prove up all those facts, I think they have a pretty strong case on that count. Now, there are other charges. There are another 6 charges relating to obstruction of justice and conspiracy and false statements to federal officials. There's a lot to prove up. It's an extensive indictment. As far as consequences go, some of these charges, Erica, carry a penalty of up to 20 years in prison per count and up to a $250,000 fine per count. He could easily be in jail for the rest of his natural life if he's convicted and sentenced to jail. I want to emphasize, Erica, president's innocence until proven guilty. The Justice Department bears the burden of proof. And at the end of the day, we have to see what his defense is when he goes to trial, if he goes to trial.
Is it a conflict of interest that these charges are coming from an administration whose leader is running against former President Trump? What's your take on that? And is that a valid argument?
It's hugely problematic from a political perspective. Today, you have a special prosecutor designed to try and isolate that person from politics, but he ultimately works for the AG, as we saw Bob Mueller did as well. And the AG, for better or for worse, ultimately works for the president. So if the current president, President Biden, continues to run for office, that does make this dramatically more politically fraught and allows President Trump, as he has already, to raise this objection that I'm being prosecuted by my opponent in the election, by a president of the opposing party, by somebody who ran against me before, that this makes the Justice Department complicit and the FBI complicit, and this is all a big witch hunt. Now, there does appear to be merit to these charges, but President Trump has getting a lot of political steam behind these arguments amongst his base. And, if he's the nominee of the Republican Party and ultimately the candidate, and this actually benefits him politically, which it appears to be doing currently, well, that makes it more likely he's the president and is able to either pardon himself or end the prosecution.
There's another point from critics of this whole process. We have President Biden's own ongoing investigation. So far, he's not facing any charges, but also had classified documents. What's your take on what might happen with that one? He has a different special prosecutor.
Right. So the special prosecutor in that case, investigating President Biden's retention of classified documents when he was vice president and senator, is a guy named Rob Hur. He was the U.S. attorney in Maryland under President Trump, a Republican political nominee and appointee. I know Rob. He's a good lawyer, good prosecutor, and he's trying to make an assessment about whether charges ought to be brought in that case, and he'll, if appropriate, impanel a grand jury to investigate it as well. So that's a separate matter. Now, what is different, I think, about and remember, Vice President Mike Pence also had classified documents. He's been told by the Justice Department that he's no longer under investigation, that charges will not be brought in the Pence case. And then, of course, remember Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had that email server, and she had material that was later on after the fact determined to have been classified. All these things are coming together and being raised by the Trump team. It is notable, though, that the Biden and Pence cases are somewhat different in that both voluntarily identify these documents and turn them over to the government, which is different than the Trump case, because in the Trump case, while they also voluntarily identified and turned over some documents, they then also were subpoenaed and turned over more documents. And then ultimately, the FBI, suspecting that there were more documents, obtained a search warrant, conducted a search, and found another 102 documents. That's what gives rise to the willful retention charge that has been brought against President Trump. And all that also makes it different than Biden and Pence.
So what is the potential impact or the implications if Trump continues to be a presidential candidate throughout this case, or even is ultimately elected president?
We've seen in the past, in the 1920s, a socialist named Eugene Debs ran for president from prison and said that if he was elected, that he'd pardon himself. The president has already said publicly that if he's convicted, he will continue to run. He will not stand down. And that he hasn't, I don't know if he said it directly, but I think everyone sort of believes that he'll consider either pardoning himself, or if he's not convicted by that point, that he will tell the Justice Department to drop the charges. There is some government-based arguments for that. There's an Office of Legal Counsel memo from the early 2000s that says a president cannot be constitutionally prosecuted while in office, and that the only remedy for that is impeachment. There's some debates about what exactly that means, but that'll be another issue the Justice Department will have to grapple with if, in fact, the president is still being prosecuted at the time that if the former president is reelected.
So our regular listeners know that here at The Newsworthy, we try to look at news sources from the right, left, and center for any political story we mention in our weekday news roundups. And our next guest, Henry A. Brechter, is from an organization committed to doing the same and beyond. He's the editor-in-chief of AllSides.com, a balanced news service and media solutions company. AllSides uses scientific, multipartisan methods to evaluate and rate various news outlets, and it presents headlines from all sides of the political spectrum side by side. And we'll talk about how the Trump indictment is being depicted across the media landscape. Plus, he shares what news consumers can do to make sure they're getting the full picture. But first, a quick break for our sponsors. I'm pretty picky about the shoes I buy these days because I need them to keep up with me. This summer, my family and I want to travel. We want to attend fun events like monthly concerts in the park, and of course, make time for outings with friends. So I want shoes that are stylish. I need them to be comfortable, and I'd like them to be versatile too, for all the different things that we'll be doing. So no matter what summer brings me, I've realized Rothy's flats, sneakers, and sandals are my go-to when I need cute, comfortable shoes that also pair well with so many different outfits. I'm amazed at the quality and durability of all my Rothy's shoes so far as well. I've had a couple of them for years at this point, and they still look and feel great. They're not only made to last, they're also machine washable. I love that everything at Rothy's is also sustainably made with their signature thread knit from recycled plastic bottles. I mean, over 158 million and counting have been used. So for stylish and comfortable shoes, shop Rothy's. Get $20 off your first purchase at rothys.com/newsworthy. That's ROTHYS, rothys.com/newsworthy. And thanks to our other sponsor, AG1. Some habits can be hard to stick to, but have you ever had certain ones that you start to crave because they just make you feel better? That's what the daily nutrition supplement AG1 has become for me. I was looking for something that would help with boosted energy, better gut health, and a way to get a wide variety of nutrients without having to take a million pills. And now I get all of it with AG1. In fact, it now feels like an easy little something that I do just for myself each morning. It's 1 scoop of powder mixed with water, and I was surprised how quickly I noticed that it helps me with improved digestion, morning hydration, and just an overall feeling that I'm ready to start the day. AG1 is made from 75 of the highest quality whole food sourced ingredients from around the world, intentionally curated for their ability to nourish all of the body's systems in harmony. So if you are looking for a simpler, effective investment for your health, try AG1. And listen to this, you can get 5 free AG1 travel packs and a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/newsworthy. That's drinkag1.com/newsworthy. Check it out. Okay, now to our conversation with AllSides.com Editor-in-chief, Henry A. Brechter. Henry, thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Erica. Excited to discuss this important topic.
Let's talk about what you've seen so far when it comes to the Trump indictment and how this is playing out in the media. What has stood out to you in the coverage from left-leaning outlets, and then we'll talk about the right-leaning outlets?
Media on the left, probably somewhat predictably, have suggested that this was a long time coming. Trump is a career criminal who doesn't deserve the honor of the White House again. And in their coverage, a lot of outlets on the left, some in the center as well, sort of the mainstream legacy outlets, are focusing on the specifics of the case. You know, the amount of documents that Trump had at Mar-a-Lago, or his apparent unwillingness at times to comply with the investigation and federal authorities. Some, like in an article we noticed from the Associated Press, which we rate at AllSides as lean left, that article focused especially on the potential for protests in the wake of the indictment, sort of framing Trump as a dangerous presence in politics and one that needs to be countered. And this is very similar to the trend in coverage we saw pre-2020 election as well.
And what about the right-leaning outlets? What have you seen there?
Yeah, so that's been much different from the left side. On the right side of the news media, the far more common is the angle that the Biden administration is targeting its most formidable political opponent. Some are focusing especially on Biden's own situation with a smaller number of classified documents that he had in personal spaces, or similar situations with Bill Clinton and the Clinton family. Others are suggesting that the timing of the indictment specifically, others on the right, is suspect and maybe meant to divert attention away from the allegations about a Biden family bribery scheme that House Republicans are drilling down on right now. So the left and the right media are definitely giving their audiences separate truths. And that's a bit separate from what we're seeing from editorial boards on left and right, which I actually think is a bit more interesting than the predictable partisanship we've seen in the news headlines. Okay,
so share a little bit from that.
In my opinion, it's always important to read opinions in addition to news. But in this case, I think it's especially important. We're seeing some important nuances and sort of divides, especially on the right side. From left to right, National Review, which we rate on the right, which is typically a very conservative publication, all the way to the New York Times, which we rate their editorial board as being on the left. Many agree that the charges were warranted. National Review, I believe, called them damning. And the Washington Post, obviously, also we rate as lean left, said, quote, that Trump left prosecutors very little choice. In New York, the New York Times, I think, ran a headline from the editorial board saying Trump should never be again trusted with the nation's secrets. The Wall Street Journal's editorial board, conversely, sort of called out the Justice Department for supposedly weaponizing itself to take down Trump. And those papers in particular disagreed about the Presidential Records Act and whether or not that could have protected Trump or if prosecutors should have acknowledged that more in the indictment. And so very interesting splits there from some thought leaders in the media that readers should definitely check out to fill in the blanks with the news coverage.
How do you like to tell news consumers to think about facts and evidence versus bias and slant?
Our position at AllSides is that bias is unavoidable. And so the key is to just get multiple perspectives. You're never going to be able to outrun the bias just by reading one or two articles, no matter how trusted that source supposedly is. And so in reading the text of the indictment, people should also read the critics of the indictment, right? Who are maybe in their own mind filling in whatever the indictment left out. And whether or not you agree, whatever side you agree with, it's important to get both so you can make your own decision, because the media, the news should not make your decisions for you. That should be up to you after you read what they have to say.
So when we're talking about the public, how do you think media bias influences public perception and understanding of a case like the Trump indictment that we're seeing now?
In this case, bias can directly influence, the results of an election. If people on one side or the other are only reading one side of the story over and over and over again. And that's why bias, if left unchecked by consumers, can absolutely have an effect on the democratic process and elections if people are only getting one side of the story and aren't fully informing themselves.
And do you think public perception can ultimately influence the case itself, a court case like this?
Absolutely, especially when it does seem from opinion polls, whether it's people don't want a Biden-Trump rematch or people think Trump is actually guilty of a crime. That, either way, is definitely going to shift how the Biden administration, the Justice Department, handle this very carefully from their perspective. And then, obviously, we're seeing Trump already start to capitalize on this. I think he's raised almost $7 million since the indictment happened on June 8th.
Have you found that the coverage of these federal charges is different than the New York charges that we saw against Trump earlier? And I ask because it at least seemed to me that more people felt the New York charges were less serious or less warranted than what we're hearing from people this time around.
100%. I think that's spot on. And that sentiment has been shared not just by one side, but across the spectrum. We're seeing that these charges are much more significant than the New York charges, much more damning in the words of people on both the left and the right in terms of the detail, the level of detail about the alleged crimes.
What steps overall can news consumers take to help navigate bias? And I know we've talked a little bit about this already of checking multiple perspectives. I know that's something we do as well with every story, is look across multiple news articles, and that's something that's really good for news consumers to do as well. Anything else you want to add about navigating all of this? And do you think that media bias has gotten more extreme in more recent years?
We find now when we point out examples of bias, readers are like, yeah, and like no one's surprised, right? So I think it's become more extreme, but also just more ingrained in the cycle, and people have become sort of numb to it. So that's one part of it. But as far as steps outside of checking multiple perspectives, another key element of responsible news consumption is differentiating between news and opinion and sort of the gray area analysis content. And part of the problem is that news outlets don't often do a good enough job of labeling the different content. And so sometimes there's ambiguity when news will be reading an article that presents itself as news, but halfway through, it's read more like an opinion piece, or there's a lot of subjective analysis and sort of paraphrasing of quotes, or not linking to primary sources and that sort of thing. And so differentiating between those things and still consuming it all, but just understanding where it's coming from and if it's totally fact-based and you could take it as such versus it's just someone's perspective and you can consider it, but you shouldn't run to the bank with it. That difference is key, but people should read all of it to get the full picture, whether that's on the Trump story or anything else in general.
Well, thank you so much to both Henry A. Brechter from AllSides.com and Jamil Jaffer from the National Security Institute for sharing their insights. For more news and analysis from the National Security Institute, you can join their email list for updates. Just visit nationalsecurity.gmu.edu. And to make AllSides.com part of your news diet, you can subscribe to their newsletters at allsides.com/newsletters. Of course, stay tuned to the Newsworthy's regular episodes for updates on this Trump case and the rest of the news to know each weekday. And we'll be back on Monday. For now, have a great weekend and happy Father's Day tomorrow to any dads listening.